Hello aspirants, welcome to PW OnlyIAS English channel. I am here Harpreet Singh again with the news analysis from the Hindu for the date 11th September 2024. Let's understand and analyze the various important articles from the Hindu. Let's begin. We have picked up various important articles. One, the Turning the Tide, the Odisha Tribal Study, the 54th GST Council Meet, National Research Foundation, India's 4-point principles, India UAE Nuclear Pact, and the editorial dealing with the Chinese-African relations. Let's analyze them in detail. There was an article in the newspaper today, The Hindu, which dealt with, or I would say a rather good news, which basically said that various tribals, even from the most backward areas, are entering the famous, or I to say the apex medical colleges and the engineering colleges. That is a good news. Now, what we can learn from this article, we need to see that. See, this article basically mentions a tribe, Khand tribe. It also mentions one of the tribes which belongs to the particularly vulnerable tribal groups. Now, for us, this can be a case study, but also remember that we need to analyze that there are certain issues also mentioned over here, which we need to study in detail. See what you need to study. See, at present, when we see the tribal status, the news mentioned in the article is a good aspect that many might be entering. But overall, if we see, according to the Ministry of Tribal Affairs and according to the Kaka Committee report, we see there is a lot of issues that are prevailing among the tribal communities. And let us see them. If you see the tribal education and the related statuses, at the literacy level, you will see India's literacy is 72.9% as per the 2011 census, whereas the scheduled type literacy is merely 59%. Now, if I see the dropout statistics from 6 to 17 years, according to the National Family Health Survey, you will be realizing that all India level, the dropout is, let us say, close to 50% for the boys, and for the girls, it is close to 48%. While for the scheduled tribes, it is 70.6%, and for the girls, it is 71.3%. So the article, though mentions a positive side, we need to understand that is few of the exceptions that are prevailing. Overall, the tribal situation is not that good. So we need to analyze this from the perspective of the issues that are prevailing. Now, if I want to resolve this issue from the perspective of an aspirant, what I should know, how these things can be resolved, and for that, certain recommendations made by certain government committees become very important. Regarding this, the Kaka Committee report had basically recommended that establishing the tribal research centers who study the tribals in detail. Along with that, they will be responsible for documentation of the tribal languages, integration of the tribal studies in their education system so that we are able to understand about the tribals, gain knowledge about them. Along with it, protective measures should be provided to the tribals. So these are some of the recommendations that are present by the Kaka Committee. Now, one more thing in the article is mentioned about a tribe known as BondaTribe. Now, remember how this becomes important. In the examination, because this article mentions, let us say, the Khand tribe again in Odisha, BondaTribe in Odisha, you might be given a question in a preliminary examination mentioning certain tribes, and they will ask you, where do these tribes belong, or which state do they belong to? These types of questions are very often asked. That is why the questions on tribal become very, very important. So they mention that BondaTribe in Odisha, it is a PVTG, particularly vulnerable tribal group. Now see, we will not go into the intricacies of this topic, but please remember, if you want to understand the concept of particularly vulnerable tribal group, it is easy to understand. See, let us see the population of India as a whole, right? Among the population, you realize that certain people might be, let us say, isolated, certain may be backward with respect to economy and various dimensions, which we might be defined as the tribal people. Now, tribal is a cultural word, cultural terminology, because it is defined and characterized based on their characteristics or socio-cultural characteristics. On the other hand, among the tribes also, you'll be realizing the reservation that is provided is not to all tribals, but only specific set of people who are designated as scheduled tribes. Among the tribes also, you'll be having various tribes which are further isolated, further backward. So, this is a Administrative term. Administrative term. Now, among the scheduled tribes also, there are certain tribes which might be extremely backward. For example, the Bonda tribes, or you might see in the form of, let us say, the Jarawas of Andaman Nicobar. These might be very backward. So, we have currently approximately 705 scheduled tribes. Out of these, there are certain which are most backward, which are referred to as particularly vulnerable tribal groups. These are 75 right now. So this is what is the system that you should have a brief idea about. Right now, based on that particular article, we have studied or understood something about the tribals also. This is very, very important when you are studying your preliminary examination and also for your mains examination, because the tribal, the scheduled tribe thing can be asked in paper 1 also, paper 2 also, with respect to policies also, even in your ethics paper also, these can be asked, and they become very important when you're writing even essays also. And along with it, these are very important elements of the vulnerable sections, right? So let's move ahead. Now see, in one of the articles was that the government of the group of ministers basically decided to tax on the health and life cover soon. So when the topics of GST has come, it is very, very important. When this article is prevalent, we will be realizing that on certain things the rates might be reduced, on certain things rates might be increased. That is fine. That will keep on changing. We need to understand the impact also. But what is more important for us is that the 54th GST Council meeting took place. Now, firstly, under the chairmanship of the Union Minister of Finance. It is not under the Minister of, let us say, State, or let us say Home, or some other minister. It is under the chairmanship of the Union Minister of Finance. Sometimes in your examination, you tend to get confused and mark it wrong. These can be asked as one of the statements in your preliminary examinations. What importance we derive from this is we will study these things in little bit detail with respect to what were the outcomes of the meeting. Let's see what was the outcome of the GST Council meeting. See the key highlights. Now what has happened is, cancer drugs, there are various drugs that have been mentioned over here. Now the GST rate on them has been reduced or recommended to be reduced from 12% to 5%, because it was asked that this is a very sensitive topic where people already are suffering because of cancer and they are being taxed at 12%, so that needs to be reduced. So GST Council has basically recommended for this reduction. First. Second is metal scrap. Now for metal scrap, a new word over here has been used that is very important. It says in the GST Council meeting, reverse change mechanism to be introduced for the supply of metal scrap. Now, as a person who's preparing for civil services, this word can be simply put in your examination and asked, what do you understand by the concept of reverse change mechanism? In the examination, when you haven't read it, it becomes very confusing. So we will study this also, don't worry. Right now we are studying the key highlights. One is a cancer drug recommendation, other is a metal scrap. Then we have certain exemptions which have been taken as a decision when we see the 54th GST Council meet. GST Council recommended to exempt the supply of R&D services by a government entity or as a research association, university, college or institution notified under the Section 35 or the Income Tax Act using government or private grants. Now, this is also seen as a means because certain exemptions, when not prevalent and being taxed, leads to decrease in the input for the research and development sector. So exempting them sometimes is a boost to that particular sector, particularly when the R&D funding in our country is relatively less. The private sector does not contribute a lot. Even when the government is also doing R&D, if it is being taxed itself, that creates hindrances in the R&D services that are there. So it is an exemption has been recommended over here, which is a very positive way forward. These were certain decisions that were taken in the GST Council meet, which you should know. Now comes the important thing, the concept that you are learning here. I had mentioned that reverse change mechanism. Now, what is reverse change mechanism? Please understand. Under normal circumstances, the supplier of goods and services pays the tax on the supply, right? The supplier is the one who's paying the tax. Under the reverse change mechanism, the recipient of goods and services becomes liable to pay the tax. That means, for example, A is sending to B. Now, A is a supplier. A will be paying the tax. Now what is happening under the reverse change mechanism, the recipient, the person who is receiving will be liable to pay the tax. So that is why reverse change mechanism is present, because it is reverse of this normal condition. So please keep this in mind. This is important from the preliminary point of view also. What are the objectives? See, it widens the scope to levy tax on the various unorganized sector. Secondly, to exempt specific classes of suppliers and to tax the import on the services. So these are the various objectives due to which this has been adopted. But most important is knowing the concept of RCM. Let's move ahead. Now, what is, from your perspective, you should know about GST Council also. That is also important. Please understand. Backs to basics. It is firstly a constitutional body. First. Second, it is formed under Article 279A subsection A by the 101 or the 101 Constitutional Amendment Act. Now, please understand, as there certain recommendations were being made, which we read right now. Now, these GST Council recommends the GST rates for the union and the states under the Article 275A subsection 4. Now, these are again back to the basics topics which we generally cover, is something that you should know as basics. If you haven't read it, this is a knowledge you can gain. If you haven't read it, it is a revision for you, right? Now, out of that particular article, do you realize simply that article would have appeared very boring? Did you realize that we have learned certain concepts, we have learned the basic aspect and what certain changes have been recommended? These are the things learned from that particular article of the Hindu. Let's move ahead. Now, this is very, very important, and I'm telling you, this can come in your mains examination also, and definitely for the prelims examination. It mentions that Prime Minister Modi convenes the first meeting of the National Research Fund Board. Now, from the perspective, the moment this word is mentioned, a candidate might be reading, okay, some board might be there, and we just have to read it that a meeting has been convened. No. Please understand, you need to know the background also. See, the Anusandhan National Research Foundation Act 2020 or ANRF Act was actually came into force in 2023. Now, under this board is present. So, we need to have a brief idea what this basically is, what are the functions and what are the various aspects associated with this particular act. Now, this act establishes this particular fund, right? Now, let's move ahead. The act provides for the establishment of National Research Foundation. National Research Foundation. What is this National Research Foundation? It is an apex body in the country to provide strategic direction for the research, innovation and entrepreneurship. Now, the research foundation that is created, it basically aims to promote what? Research, innovation and entrepreneurship. In which areas? In the areas of, let us say, natural science, including mathematics, the engineering and technology sector, then environment and earth science related activities, health and agriculture sector, science and technological interfaces, which basically link the humanities and the science sections. So, in all these things, promotion of research and innovation and entrepreneurship is for what the National Research Foundation has been established. Now, let's move ahead. NRF functions. What are the functions of NRF? See, it is preparing roadmaps and plans. Next, facilitate and finance the growth of R&D sector, more research and development in the sectors that we have mentioned. Providing grants for research proposals, support for the translation of research into application. For example, certain research has been prepared. Now, it is very attractive, very innovative, but it should also be practically should be applicable at a ground level. Let us say a technology or an software has been prepared. Now, that software could be integrated with some, could be used for, let us say, for the public services. So, putting into application and facilitating that is a very important role. Next is international collaborations, and next is encouraging investment from the public and the private sector both. So, these are some of the functions. Now comes the funds for NRF, right? The fund is there. Now, from where do they get the fund? Either from the grants and loans from the central government, donations that come, or let us say the income from the investment, because the foundation had basically, your research foundation had basically helped you in, let us say, application of a particular research. So, certain contribution can come from the particular investment that are made. So, these are certain sources from which the funds come. Now, next important thing is governing board. The board meeting that took place, which was mentioned in the article, is this governing board. It also has an executive council, but right now we are mentioning or studying the board. Now, board is headed by the Prime Minister. This can be very well asked in your preliminary examination or also for the mains examination. Now, it is headed by the Prime Minister, Honorable Prime Minister of India. The Union Minister of Science and Technology is a Vice President. Principal Scientific Advisor is a member secretary of this board. Along with it, secretaries from the Department of Science and Technology, Biotechnology, Scientific and Industrial Research are also the members of this governing board where the meeting took place. Now, did you realize that simple small article that you saw has so much things to study, and a simple, or rather a very simple question that could be prepared from that particular article, you would have found it very difficult to attempt it because you might have not even studied this. So those articles have a lot of relevance from the prelims point of view and also from the mains, because this can be asked in your mains examination also. Let's move ahead. Next is India has 4-point principle to end Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now please understand, today is 11th September. In the previous day's news, that is 10th of September, I had mentioned Swiss peace process. In the Swiss peace process, when we were dealing with the recent summit that took place in June 2024, when we mentioned about India's position, we said that India's position was that India would not be a part of the process till the time Russia is also on the table and a party to the discussion. If Russia is not a party to the discussion, India will not participate. This is what was mentioned. Background article on the 10th of September, Swiss peace process. Now, why this article becomes very important? Now, the Honorable Minister of External Affairs, in one of his recent meetings in Berlin, he had basically mentioned that, see, what India's stand is. Now, this becomes very important because, please, this is topic of Russia and Ukraine conflict is an issue. That means every next day or one day after, or the second day in a simple way, you will be getting certain articles on Russia and Ukraine conflict. Now, new changes are going to come, new happenings will be there. So, these things become very important from the perspective of understanding the issue, first of all, what the issue is. Now, what India's stand is very important, because when you write your answer, at the last, you will have to also mention what India's position is. Now, what India's position is mentioned in this article, which I have basically listed over here with respect to Russia and Ukraine conflict. What India's position is. See this. This should be the time of peace. That means India has made us stand very clear. Now, enough has happened. Enough of loss of life, property, humanitarian crisis has happened. Now, it is important that peace should prevail. Now, this is India's stand. Second point, there should be no solution to the war on the battlefield. What does that mean? You are basically fighting the war. It will not lead to any solution. That is why India said, stop this war and come on the table and discuss and resolve the issue. Third, Russia must be a party to the table for any successful process. This is one of the major or primary points why India said it will not be the party to the Swiss peace process, because Russia was not there in the June 2024 meeting. This is a very, very important stand that India took, right? That is why we say Russia is an evergreen friend of India. Russia has supported India in the past also. Now, over here, India has very categorically said that if all the parties involved are not part of this discussion, it is of no use. Next, India's last point is India is concerned and engaged in trying to find a way to resolve the conflict. Now, very categorically, the India stand is that India is itself involved and is trying its best to resolve the conflict. Now, whenever in the examination, the question of Ukraine or Russia's conflict come, a little bit can be mentioned about what the conflict is, what are the various issues that are prevailing, whether there is a humanitarian crisis, food security crisis, let us say energy crisis, nuclear security crisis, all these problems are prevailing. Then we need to analyze what are the steps that are being taken. Let us say Swiss peace process is one of the steps that has been taken. Various diplomatic channels are being opened. United Nations is also involved. But we need to understand what India's stand is. Now, these four statements, four principles given by the Honorable Minister of External Affairs depict or show what India's stand on this particular issue is. This is very important. You should all note it and keep it in mind. Let's move ahead. Now, India UAE Ink Pact for Civil Nuclear Cooperation. Now, this is very, very important because India is a very good friend of the UAE. Now, the Crown Prince visited New Delhi, where we see that India UAE signed the 5 key agreements in New Delhi. Now, let's move ahead and see. See the India UAE Civil Nuclear Energy Agreement. Now, it has been signed between the Nuclear Power Corporation of India Limited, NPCIL, with the Emirates Nuclear Energy Company for Baraka Nuclear Power Plant for its maintenance and operations. Now, why this becomes important is, please understand, this particular nuclear plant is at Abu Dhabi, UAE, and it is the first nuclear energy plant in the Arab world. This particular statement, one of the statements, can be used in your preliminary questions also, and you can be asked that. That is why these small details also become very, very important, right? From the mains perspective, obviously the relationship. From the prelims perspective, these minute details become very important. Let's move ahead. Now, areas of cooperation: nuclear safety, health, agriculture, and science and technology are where they basically discuss the concerns also and where they can collaborate also. Let's move ahead. Because we are talking about nuclear energy, there is certain thing that you should all be very well aware of. This can be very well asked in your examination. That is International Atomic Energy Agency. Now, this agency was established in 1957 with a headquarters in Vienna, Australia. What is its role? Please understand, every single word that is mentioned on the board right now is very important. It is picked up from here and placed in your civil services preliminary examination. It is an intergovernmental organization, firstly. It seeks to promote peaceful use of the nuclear energy. It inhibits the use of nuclear energy for the military purposes, including the nuclear weapons, right? It is an autonomous organization within the United Nations. It is governed by its own founding treaty. Along with it, please remember, it reports both to the United Nations General Assembly and the Security Council. Please note it. Please note it. Now, these are the certain points or aspects that you should know with respect to the International Atomic Energy Agency, because we are already dealing and studying with respect to the nuclear energy. Now, any 2 or 3 statements can be picked up and placed in your preliminary examination. So, whether it is intergovernmental or non-governmental, the word what is mentioned over is intergovernmental. These are the correct words that are used. It can be told that it is a part of, directly a part of United Nations. No, it is an autonomous organization within the United Nations. So, these are certain statements that you should be very well aware, where UPSC can ask your questions, and they can basically they use English or a language as a means to confuse you, right? Next, let's move ahead. Okay. Next is basically your editorial that is mentioned here. Please remember, now this editorial is important from the perspective that certain words have been mentioned here and a broad overview is also mentioned. Now, please understand, this article mentions that the Chinese and the African relations have over the time improved, and China is investing there, collaborating with them, and the interlinkages between the Chinese and the African economy is increasing. On the other hand, we see that India has taken a back seat, or it appears to have taken a back seat. Now, there are certain things which this particular editorial analyzes from a broad end. Let us see them. When we see the introductory paragraph, we see it mentions the Forum for China-African Cooperation, or FOCAC. Now, as a person who is preparing for civil services, you should have a brief idea of what this FOCAC is. Now, the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation, this has China and all African countries except for the Kingdom of Eswatini. Now, in your prelims, they can ask you, every single nation of Africa is a part of this. No, except for the Kingdom of Eswatini. So, these are small things which can be asked. Clear? Next, it is primarily a multi-level coordination mechanism between African countries and China, and formed in October 2020. Now, this is something, a brief detail you should know. Now, let's come back. When we see over here, we realize that first they mention is that this is a forum through which the interaction between China and Africa has been continuously going on. Next important thing that the writer of this editorial mentions is that now the relations have become much more cordial and comfortable between Africa and China. Earlier, and when China entered the African continent, there were certain countries who were opposing or skeptical about what China might possibly destroy their economy, and certain issues were prevailing among the minds of the Chinese countries or the heads of the states. But now we see through this article also that more comfortable relations have been established between China and Africa. Now it mentions that FOCAC first summit took place in 2020. From that time till 2024, there has been a rapid change that has taken place. The recent summit of FOCAC that took place, through which details have been mentioned over here, which we are going to basically see in the next slide also, that various agreements, various collaborations have been made. China is basically giving a large amount of funds and grants to Africa. Now that is basically helping the various African countries getting closer to China. This is where particularly where India is lacking behind. See, it is all about the funding and the money that they are getting, which can be used by the countries for their development and other policy making in the African nations, which China is providing. Now, for China, Africa is an extension of the Belt and Road route, what they basically see as a means of expansion of the Chinese philosophy, ideology, and their economy. Now, let us see what are the recent summit outcomes. Please understand, FOCAC basically said China-Africa Community for Shared Future. What they have basically done is leaving the racial aspects aside. You know very well that through the various generations and all, when we study the racial concept, we study the concept of Negroids, Mongoloids, and obviously the Caucasoids. These are various races, three major races. Now, this particular China-African community creates a close connect between the African people and the Chinese people. That is, the people shedding aside the racial differences and they being treated as one particular community, which are one with respect to, let us say, economy, agriculture, education, and various dimensions. So, this is representing the close connect. This is an ideological impact that China is having on the African nations, where they are being considered as one particular community which have a common future. The future which the Chinese nation is predicting as a bright one, where a lot of investment would be there and the African nation would be prosperous. Next, China Belt and Road Initiative. Now, India already has been skeptical. Along with it, the Quad nations, which we know, meetings have been there in order to counter the China Belt and Road Initiative. So, China considers Africa as an extension of that particular initiative, through which massive infrastructure building would be done in Africa. And what will happen is that obviously the closer relations would be there. It will improve the export aspects, provide them a market for, let us say, for the Chinese products. So this is basically an extension. The African nations and the China are agreeing on the concept of implementation of the sustainable development goals. They have this as commonality, that they're all going to work towards implementation of this goal. Next is governance, modernization, and poverty reduction. Now, what China is basically doing is, it is aiming at, let us say, massive funding, provision of, let us say, establishment of various schools, colleges, infrastructure building, collaborating with the governments for various initiatives, technology interventions, improving the governance models. And all these things have the various governments of African nations have been collaborating with the Chinese government. Next, the most important thing over here is $51 billion soft loan and grants by China. Now, this is what is a change maker. When such a big amount is being given to the African nations, to the FOCAC, what it does is that it makes the African nations loyal to the China. And what happens then? It will be easier for China to seek support even at the United Nations level, even at the regional forums, and it can be used, even China can use this as a counter against India and the Quad nations. So this is, from the perspective, increasing relations between Africa and China are a point of concern for India also. Now see, where does India stand? Please understand, problem has been that though we saw, or we began with the African Nation Summit in 2015, that basically was depicting a very close bond between Africa and Asia. But after that, after 2015, we almost paused these summits. What had to continue even after that, we see a pause there. And that is what is a problematic situation. We need to again have those regular meetings. We need to have again the high level interactions. Let us say the Prime Minister visiting the African nations, their Prime Ministers and Head of States visiting India. This interaction needs to continue. We need to nurture the historical relationships that are there. Remember, the people from, let us say, Andaman Islanders, they are equally a part of India, have their origination from Africa. The Siddhi tribe in the Gujarat, Maharashtra and Karnataka region have African traits. We all belong to one community because we all have been a common sufferers of the colonialism that we faced. That is why even today, African people have a very close connect with India. We need to foster and develop this. We should work together towards building a common future, what China is trying to do. Now we need to, even for here, people to people contact, tourism, funding, development, all these things need to go together. Now this is what was the important aspect. Now this is my Telegram account where the PDF which I have written over here would be present. You can subscribe to this Telegram channel and you can get the PDF of the complete work that has been done on the board. Let's move back here. This was the current affairs for the 11th of September 2024. We tried to cover the various dimensions prevailing in the newspaper. On Saturdays, we will have a more rigorous discussion for certain articles which might be missed throughout the week, could be covered on Saturday. Along with it, we will be adding soon the concept of MCQs and other discussions also. Hopefully, you liked what was taught to you or holistically understood what the various dimensions were. Please remember, newspaper reading is a must. Analysis is even further important because you are the ones who have to create your answers in your main examination. Along with it, when you read the articles, please remember, merely reading the article doesn't help. What are the dimensions associated with that article? That is where we are helping you. Along with it, remember, like a fund is being created. So what those questions can be asked in your prelims also. So we need to understand the newspaper reading from a holistic manner. Hopefully you enjoyed it. God bless you. Take care. Me signing off from PW OnlyIAS English channel. Take care and Jai Hind.